Hello, my name is Lawrence Malthouse. I'm the Solution Sales Director here at Gamma, and today I'm joined by Mark and James. We're going to be discussing the role that managed networks play, helping our retailers deploy their digital initiatives.
One of the main things that we're seeing with technology is sort of with body cameras, for instance. There's the stat that I think that there's about a 40% reduction in sort of shoplifting with the visibility of a body camera. Now, obviously, you're not going to reduce all shoplifting, but just to put it in perspective, sort of because as Mark sort of referred to, the margins there are so low, the cost actually of one shoplifted item, the amount of sales generated needed to make that back as well is about 10 to 1 with some of our retail customers. So you've got the impact that it has on employees' well-being, but also on the bottom line. So we're seeing that a lot of different teams within our retail customers are tapping into this technology to understand how the effect it can have on loss prevention, but also on staff well-being as well.
Yeah. So look, we've spoken a lot about, I guess, customer experience and how sort of technology supports the customer experience when they're in store and how it supports that end-to-end buying journey. But I guess what we haven't spoken about, and I know this comes up a lot when we talk to our customers and retailers, is their staff. I guess specifically around sort of staff security. I mean, it's in the press all the time at the moment, isn't it? We know that retail is very challenging. They have a very high turnover of staff. So what are some of the initiatives that we're seeing retailers invest in to, I guess, protect their staff and make those retail environments an attractive place to work?
So in terms of what we're seeing, obviously, you've obviously mentioned the customer experience there, the way that's constantly changing. But I think one, I guess, more concerning trend in retail has been sort of the safety of staff, but also not just in the sort of incidents that are happening in the number, but in the scale. In terms of, I guess, sort of the severity of those incidents as well. And we're seeing that retail workers are sort of ranked as sort of having sort of more mental health difficulties than other people in other industries, and I think just that high turnover as well, because that in itself, you've got the cost of obviously looking to recruit new staff, looking to upskill them. It sort of has this sort of effect on the bottom line, which you don't really realise initially. But one of the main things that we're seeing with technology is sort of with body cameras, for instance. There's the stat that I think that there's about a 40% reduction in sort of shoplifting with the visibility of a body camera. Now, obviously, you're not going to reduce all shoplifting, but just to put it in perspective, sort of because as Mark sort of referred to, the margins there are so low, the cost actually of one shoplifted item, the amount of sales generated needed to make that back as well is about 10 to 1 with some of our retail customers. So you've got the impact that it has on employees' well-being, but also on the bottom line. So we're seeing that a lot of different teams within our retail customers are tapping into this technology to understand how the effect it can have on loss prevention, but also on staff well-being as well.
Yeah. So look, I mean, we've spoken at length about retailers and how they're going through this phase of investing heavily in technology. We talked about the fact that there are very thin margins, that they're always striving to get that competitive advantage. Now, we've spoken about Wi-Fi, self-checkout, CCTV, and imagine this type of investment has profound impact on the actual underlying networks that support those digital initiatives. Just talk to me about some of the trends that we're seeing from a network perspective and the underlying network foundations that support our retailers.
I think with these cameras as well, you've obviously got the obvious CCTV elements where traditionally it's used as a deterrent, but what we're seeing more and more is that these cameras can be overlaid with software to react smarter to not just preventing, say, theft in itself, but to also detect how this theft or how this loss is occurring. So, for instance, one stat said that about 40% of loss in shops was actually from employees. Now, whether that's from a sneaky employee or whether that's just from damaged goods, having that sort of software that sits on top of the cameras, I think allows for that more intelligent reporting to prevent that loss, which, as sort of stated earlier, is so critical for so many retailers at the moment. Another smarter element that you can do with these cameras is obviously you can link it to facial recognition. Now, I know that can be quite a hot button issue for some retailers, but say you were to have this facial recognition capability within the camera, you could create, for instance, known offenders and suspected offenders. So if, for instance, a known offender walked into the store, that could be flagged centrally and they could call the police. If it was a suspected offender, for instance, that could be the manager could be alerted. So there's definitely not one set way of using these cameras and the software within it to make sure that to ensure employee safety. It can be done in a variety of ways. Moreover, these cameras can be used not just again about people in the stores, but also to monitor footfall and the sort of heat maps in the stores. And if you figure out which is the sort of most busy areas of the stores, you can then target promotions at that, or you could sell that potential area to manufacturers with the knowledge that that area of the store is most popular at certain points of the day.
With all of these additional applications and services being put onto the network, also obviously putting a much bigger strain on the network. So retailers probably want to be as cost effective as possible, so they don't want to invest into huge bandwidth. So they want to be able to use the bandwidth that they have today in a much more effective manner. So things like SD-WAN can help with that. Not that we're seeing every retailer move to an SD-WAN network. Lots are still staying on an MPLS network because we can still control traffic. But adding on the cameras, IoT devices, all of these third parties wanting access, this all puts a strain on the network. It needs managing in a much more effective way, but also the reliance on the network is obviously much greater. So lots of real-time applications now being used instead of the let's upload our stock that we need at the end of every night. This is now all being done in much more real-time basis.
Yeah. So how do you think I think you're spot on there. The importance of having that 100% uptime. We're seeing if you wind back the clock sort of 2, 3, 4 years ago, there certainly wasn't that demand of having that 24/7 uptime across networks. I mean, what do you think some of the considerations retailers are having to make from a network perspective to guarantee that uptime?
We're seeing a lot more retailers wanting a resilient service, and not just a single connection, but dual connections, and that can take many forms. Some people are putting dual physical connections in, they're using mobile services, they're even now using satellite services. And a lot of those can be used both as a fast startup service, and then once you get your physical connection in, you just leave them in place as a secondary connection. I think the retailers are having to do it for many reasons. I mean, we're mentioning retailers a lot, but you look at some of our hospitality customers, they've all moved to a cashless-based business now. So they don't take cash, they don't even have the ability to take cash. So they must be able to take those credit card payments. Yes, you potentially have the option of using offline credit card payments, but a lot of retailers don't want to use that. They're worried about PCI compliancy, and also the fact that, again, depending on the type of retailer you are, if you're taking a lot of or high volume, low value transactions like at lunchtime, and you're having to store those, how many of those may be declined for whatever reason? So you're actually putting your margins at greater risk. So you're probably better off investing in the resilient connectivity, even if it's just to make a simple credit card transaction that doesn't require a lot of bandwidth. So make the investment in the secondary so you can take those transactions and you keep your margins high.
And how do you think that works with you mentioned sort of seasonal fluctuations, maybe not seasonal fluctuations, but even day to day, where you're finding at certain parts of the year or day there's more that's being run over the network. The network may be running at full capacity. What about the ability for that underlying network to cope with that shift in or balance in usage day in, day out?
Well, I think that's allowing you to dynamically allocate bandwidth, speed, etc. to particular applications. So understanding what your critical applications are on your network is probably the first thing to do. Most retailers will probably understand that. Most retailers and hospitality companies we speak to have very similar profile of absolute critical applications. One of those being credit card transactions and some others. But when you look at hospitality, for example, they'll potentially put guest wireless much higher than a retailer may. So it will depend on, again, what sector you're working within, what you're particularly selling, and I think the volumes that you're doing, your turnover of your customer. Is your customer going to stay in your location for a minute, for 10 minutes, for half an hour or an hour? That will make some differences in your applications.
Well. And I think in terms of that application landscape, as you said, retail is quite a broad spectrum. So when you split that down, there are certain subcomponents of retail where that cloud first initiative and drive to putting their clouds in the apps in the apps in the cloud is slightly more developed than other areas. How do you see that panning out in retail from a network perspective? We now know that most retailers are pushing their applications to the cloud. So what impact does that have on the underlying network, and how does that work against some of the more traditional hub and spoke technologies and topologies that we've been used to seeing?
Well, we know not just in retail, but most organisations are looking at the cloud, whether they have a cloud-first strategy or somewhere in between. Lots of people are trying to shut down their own data centres or certainly scale them back significantly. So being closer to your applications is obviously more important. You don't want to have to flow through data centres to get to your cloud-based applications. You'd much prefer to go straight into them. So it's certainly having a strain. I mean, the biggest point is probably security. You're now opening your network. If you're a retailer with a couple of hundred stores and you used to have everything in a data center, then your access out to the internet would be via one or two points from your data centers. Now it's potentially every single store is an attack footprint for you. So while you're trying to be as flexible as possible, get as close to your applications as possible, you now have to have a much further reaching security strategy.
I mean, I think it's definitely true to say that threat landscape has certainly evolved. So from a design point of view, when it comes to networking, what are some of the thoughts or considerations that retailers need to think about?
So I think to answer your question, you've got a lot more. Well, you've got a lot of application. You've got much more applications spread in a lot more locations. You've also got to be a lot more wary of your third-party providers as well. So investment in security is probably becoming more critical. Instead of your traditional, let's just put a firewall put a firewall in place, you're now having to look at much deeper security, so data loss, network access control, and this is really leading into SD-WAN, but also SASE. So depending on what your locations look like, how your staff are spread out, then certainly SD-WAN is becoming more embedded within the retail environment and the hospitality environment, but with more and more remote workers, then being able to secure them, allowing them to have direct access to the applications as well is critical.
So do you think SD-WAN is now the de facto standard for retailers moving forwards? Anyone who's considering their retail network?
I think if anybody is considering refreshing their network, then SD-WAN needs to be considered. I think we're seeing a bigger percentage of retailers moving to SD-WAN. There are still not a number of retailers just using MPLS networks. I don't think SD-WAN has killed MPLS, and we're seeing a lot of retailers that do deploy dual connectivity into a site actually having one of those as an MPLS connection and one as a direct internet connection, and allowing the SD-WAN to make decisions on which application should go over which connection.
Okay, so we talked about different technologies, security being pushed to the edge, SD-WAN versus MPLS. What about the more sort of practical day-to-day management of these networks? Every retailer we talk to has got a whole raft of different technologies, ragged edge contractual commitments, a state that needs to be refreshed, and multiple suppliers that they're having to actually look after on a day-to-day to drive those service levels that the business requires. So from a managed service perspective, what would you say are the sort of the top three things that retailers are asking for?
I actually think retailers aren't asking for enough when it asks about managed services. I think that they're quite hung up about the actual technology itself. And is it a green box? Is it a red box? Is it a blue box, etc.? You know, which manufacturer are you using? And they get very hung up about that, where actually the real value will come from the managed service if that's what they want. A lot of retailers are managing these things themselves. Some want completely hands-off, and probably most retailers want somewhere in between, where they want the managed service, but they want that ability to step in if they really have to. A prime example of that is if somebody wants access to a particular application, they can just jump on the firewall and make that change there and then and open up the ports instead of having to go through a process to get your managed service provider to do that.
Yeah.
So I actually think they need to be putting a lot more emphasis on the managed service, understanding what that managed service actually gives them. Yeah. So not just how quickly will I respond to it, but what is that carrier going to do?
Yeah.
You see it in cloud providers quite a lot. A lot of people go into the cloud thinking the cloud provider is going to provide the security when they don't do that at all. So understanding what that managed service gives you, and more importantly, doesn't give you, is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and I agree. I think a lot of retailers there have been used to legacy networks that have been sold with a managed service, but it's more of a sort of maintained service. So what would you say are the key things that retailers should be asking when they go to tender with regards to the I guess the level of managed service and actually what that looks like?
I think from a very high level, you need to understand what is proactive and what is reactive. So what is your managed service provider doing on a proactive basis? Are they just looking at a problem when there is a problem, or are they looking at the network to understand where a problem might start developing, and can they mitigate it before it becomes service affecting? Because that's what you want to really stop, is any service outages. So if you can be proactive and monitor as much as possible, and this might not be an actual physical outage, it might be a problem with a particular application. We've talked about retailers and hospitality spiking, not just seasonally, but within a day. So for a fast food hospitality provider, is credit card transactions more important at 9 o'clock in the morning or at midday? It's probably midday. So it's understanding where these applications, or how important they are at particular days, and ensuring that they have the right priority on that particular day.
I agree, but I think it goes even further than that. I think that degree of proactivity is clearly important, as is mapping out the roles in terms of communication and how that's going to work. But moving forwards, obviously we've spoken about how competitive this environment is. It's having the right partner in place to actually proactively advise about new technology initiatives, to make sure that as a retailer, you're always on the front foot and you can react to those initiatives that the business wants to deploy, and you haven't got a network which is limiting you or holding you back when it comes to deploying technology fast. I think that's a really important sort of layer of that managed service that maybe sometimes gets overlooked. I think you fall into that position where, well, I've got a network supply and they supply me bandwidth, but how do they choose? How does that retailer choose that partner that will stand toe to toe with them and inform them and engage them and educate them about future initiatives and how that network is going to support those?
Well, again, I think that the beginning of that process is down to the contract that you signed. So have you signed a managed service network contract, or have you signed a contract for technology? Because if you've signed a contract for a technology, you're stuck with that technology for that term of the contract. So we've seen, or we've already talked about how retailers are seeing different revenue streams. So we've talked to one retailer recently that a couple of years ago had a couple of million in e-commerce, and now I've got a couple of £100 million a year revenue in e-commerce. So their revenue streams have changed massively, and a lot of that is linked to like Uber and Deliveroo. So you've got to be able to react to that and change the technology when needed. And if you're stuck in a contract that doesn't allow you to do that, then it's very difficult. You also need to understand that technology is available. So you need that managed service provider to be proactive with you instead of reactive. And I think that's what we're seeing with a lot of contracts at the moment, is they are very reactive, and it's the retailer having to push the managed service provider instead of the managed service provider really coming to challenge the retailer.
Yeah, I think there's also a large element of cultural fit as well. I mean, we know from working with our retailers that when they say 24/7, it really is that 24/7 type business. So how capable is that managed service provider in reacting 24/7? Do they really understand your business, how it works? Do they really understand the impact of a store going down, of a manufacturing site going down, as a key distribution hub going down? And do you have the team in place that can, if necessary, work around process to get these things fixed and get them fixed fast?
Yeah, and I think that's ensuring that your managed service provider makes sure that everybody does know the impact. So number one, an MSP should be asking those questions, but also distributing that information throughout their business. So even if it is a first line help desk person, if a particular retailer or hospitality phone up, then they understand that every hour that it's down, they're losing X amount of pounds, and whether that be an actual store or, as you said, a manufacturing or logistics plant, depending on which one it is, it can have a major effect on that business. And not just there and then, that can actually cause issues the next day and the day after that. So if a store's down, can't get its stocking information to the logistics site, then they've missed the delivery for everything that's not on the shelf, and therefore they won't sell any of that tomorrow either.
Sure.
So it's quite a major
and I think
issue.
As well as giving the managed service providers staff proper visibility into the day-to-day life of the retail customer that they're supporting, obviously that's really, really, really important. But equally, I think it goes beyond that, and actually retailers have a large ecosystem of suppliers that they're working with day to day. And really, from that managed service, it's the ability to fit into that existing ecosystem of suppliers and not just elevate services through your own platforms, but help bring everyone's service offering up and elevate that by the way you communicate and the way that you share access to certain tools. So actually, all of a sudden, you're creating this I guess subset of suppliers that are working efficiently and effectively together.